Hello and welcome to the India Energy Hour. I am Sandeep Pai, a former journalist with Hindustan Times and now an energy researcher at the University of British Columbia.
And I'm Shreya Jay, journalist with Business Standard newspaper in Delhi, writing on the energy sector.
Together, we are really excited to co host a new podcast on India's energy transition, the India Energy Hour. This podcast is hosted by 101 Reporters, an innovative news agency that connects grassroots reporters and media houses to bring out untold stories. The show is produced by Tejas Dayanand Sagar of 101 Reporters.
In this podcast, we want to unpack and document India's energy transition. We will interview leading energy, development, and climate experts from academia, civil society, and the government. Through these interviews, we will explore the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities in the energy transition unfolding in India. We will examine the role of government, finance, social justice, and science. Over time, we will feature other countries of the global south as well.
COP26 concluded on November 13th with the Glasgow Climate Pact, signed by leaders from nearly 200 countries. The pact aims to limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Throughout the 2 weeks of the conference, there were numerous pledges and declarations. Many experts have hailed the Glasgow Climate Pact and the various climate pledges as a success, while others are not satisfied with these agreements. To understand the nuances of what unfolded at COP26, I interviewed Dr. Simon Evans, Deputy Editor of Carbon Brief, a UK-based website specializing in the science and policy of climate change. Simon is a leading climate and energy journalist who reported extensively on COP26. We hope you really enjoyed this episode. The India Energy Hour team will be taking a break over the holidays and returning in January with new episodes covering energy and climate issues. Welcome to the India Energy Hour. I'm really excited to talk to you about the recently concluded COP and all its major decisions. Thank you so much for joining the India Energy Hour, Simon.
Thanks for having me.
So, before we dive into the question of COP and what happened and how it unfolded in the last 2 weeks, let's hear about how did you get interested in climate and energy and I love your tweets and I follow your tweets and it's any major announcement happens and I go there and see, okay, what's the summary of what's going on right now? So tell us how you got interested in this space and where did you study, where did you come from, and so on.
Yeah, so where to begin? I mean, I guess I took quite a circuitous route into journalism. So I grew up in Brighton on the south coast of England. I've got a complicated family with parents from Australia and New Zealand and grandparents from Germany. And I went off to university to study chemistry. I was one of those people that you'd probably say I didn't really have a clue what I wanted to do with my life, but I knew I was interested in how the world works, I guess, and chemistry was a good subject. And then after that, I still didn't have a clue at all about where I was going to go with it. So I ended up in this slightly strange world at the University of Sussex, which is in Brighton, working for something called the Harvard Sussex Programme. And this is a kind of an outfit which, I mean, in some ways, on reflection, looking back at from where I am now, in some ways it is a kind of a journalistic organisation. And what they're interested in is the world of chemical and biological weapons. And so they're following, what's going on in terms of the treaties that govern those weapons, who's saying what's being reported in the news and so on. And they track all of that. And they also keep this amazing archive of official and unofficial documents relating to those topics. So I worked there for a year before deciding that, no, I really did want to go back into academia for a little bit. And I did a PhD in biochemistry in Bristol. And, I got to the end of that and I realised that, the things that I'd enjoyed the most about that process were actually writing. Weirdly, because for many PhD students, writing a thesis is a very painful process, and I don't suppose it was different for me. But I did really enjoy that thing of trying to tell a story with my research, and actually that was more interesting to me. And comparative, how does my research fit in with other people's findings? What can I say about other people's work, and how this takes things forward? That was all much more interesting to me than kind of slaving over a lab bench, banging my head against the wall because my experiment had failed to run again. So I guess I realized at that point that, kind of reading about it and explaining to other people the implications of technical scientific research was probably the sort of direction I should go in. So, I mean, that's a long answer, but, after that, it took me another year, but I then got a job as a science journalist. I was very lucky to work at the ENDS Report, which is an old environmental journal in the UK. And they were much more interested in someone with a scientific background, which was me, compared to someone who had formal journalistic training, which definitely wasn't me. And so I watched and listened, and I kind of eavesdropped on my colleagues and, learned how they did interviews and basically just picked it up on the job. And and here I am now. I guess maybe something like 10 years later. It's been quite a while.
That's quite a journey. That's quite a journey from being a scientist to a journalist. And, I guess now you're combining the two because you're like doing data-driven scientific analysis of, various climate modeling scenarios and, energy systems. So there's science and journalism. So I guess it's a nice convergence in the end. I would have asked you a lot of questions, but, in the interest of time, I will move to the topic. Describe to us, how does it feel like to be at COP? How do you keep up with all the pledges? I didn't attend COP and I was like, oh my God, every day there's like 5 new pledges. And how do you interpret this? Who are the different parties here? What are the vested interests? Are these mere pledges or there's some games? There's so much going on. So start by describing what was it like to be there, and what about all these pledges and how did you follow all that?
Yeah, so this is the fourth COP that I've been to personally. The first was Paris in 2015, and since then I've been to Katowice in 2018, Madrid in 2019, and now Glasgow. I would say, reflecting on how those conferences have been different, certainly Glasgow felt like the most hectic, and I think that was probably for a number of reasons. First of all, the pledges. I mean, it was just an absolute deluge of pledges all over the place. And secondly, just, I think the nature of the venue that the UK government had chosen, it was quite a cramped space, but also the number of delegates registered was a record. I think it was more than 40,000 people registered to attend. Whether all of them came or not, I don't know. But certainly it was very crowded, and that really added to this atmosphere of kind of intensity and an atmosphere of somewhat frenetic kind of pace. Sometimes even walking around the conference venue was very difficult. At one point, I was trying to get to an interview, and there were just huge lines of people, all with their phones out, waiting for Barack Obama to show up. And so I was just completely blocked from getting across the venue had to ring up the TV crew that were waiting for me and tell them I was going to be late. So yeah, I mean, it's certainly very difficult to keep track of what's going on in that situation. Sometimes I find, some of the COPs that I actually haven't been to, it's almost easier when you're stepping away from that noise and the pace, because as you say, you have, announcements, pledges, you have press conferences, briefings from observers and NGOs and so on. And sometimes even walking across the venue, not only because of the crowds, but you just bump into people that So it can be quite hard while you're actually there to get things done.
And just for the benefit of our listeners, can you describe the blue zone and the green zone, and can journalists go to different zones or only delegates? Can you describe that whole process?
Yeah, so typically the COP is divided into a blue zone and a green zone. The green zone is kind of open to all. It typically consists of pavilions set up by companies or universities or other organisations. I have actually a confession to make, which is that I've never ever been to the Green Zone in 4 years of going to COPs. So I can't tell you much more about it. However, the Blue Zone I'm quite familiar with. So what you get there is a mixture of journalists, observers, which can be civil society organisations, NGOs, indigenous groups, and so on. Then you have parties, which is the countries that are party to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and you have technical staff and so on. Now, inside the Blue Zone, there's various different parts of that. So some of those are accessible to all. One of the interesting things in Glasgow was that because of the Leaders Summit that they organised at the start of the meeting, and because of COVID restrictions on numbers and the size of the venue, they actually put in additional restrictions that caused a lot of upset, where things like observers were only allowed something like 4 tickets for entire observer organisations to observe the negotiations. Now, those negotiations typically happen behind closed doors. So the negotiators themselves, obviously the diplomats from all of the different countries, are in those rooms. But observer organisations are also allowed in most of the time, not always. Journalists are almost never allowed in, apart from during plenary meetings, which is where they have, like at the end of the first week, they have a plenary meeting and they explain what's happened so far. Then beyond that, there, in the Blue Zone, there's also pavilions. So, I saw one person joking that the size pavilions, different countries have effectively a space where I guess they hold events, and to an extent they're also selling themselves. And the joke was that the size and the kind of grandeur of the pavilion was inversely proportional to the strength of that country's commitments. I'm not sure if that's true, but certainly, one of the other things people noticed in Glasgow was that the best coffee was at the Australia Pavilion. That was the hot tip, and it definitely was true. I can confirm that. And of course, Australia has been criticised widely for the fact that it failed to strengthen its 2030 target.
That's great. Thanks. I think that's interesting to know. If I attend a COP next time, I'll definitely check out Australian coffee, if nothing else. So on a serious note, so what do you think were some of the key highlights of this COP? What do you think worked for you as a journalist who is observing? And what do you think were some of the things that could have been done better? I'm talking in terms of pledges or commitments and all that.
So what we've seen since the Paris Agreement in 2015 is the UN climate process it's changing. So, for many years they were working towards this universal international climate deal, which is the Paris Agreement. Now we've got it. And as of the end of the COP26 in Glasgow, they've finalised all of the detailed rules for how that system is going to operate. So certainly that was one of the big achievements in Glasgow. But what that means now is that the COP is, it's changing face somewhat. So it's going from being a rule-making organisation to being something that's more about implementation. And that's in the broadest sense. So meeting climate targets, setting new climate targets, providing finance and support of all kinds. And so that shift is taking place at the same time as the science is strengthening on, the impacts of warming beyond 1.5 degrees. And not only that, but also this huge gulf that still exists between what would be needed to stay below 1.5 and where we're currently headed. So effectively what Glasgow was trying to do was to respond to that in a couple of different ways. So one of those was this Leaders Summit and the barrage of pledges that we've talked about. Going into it, the UK presidency talked a lot about coal cars, cash and trees. So we indeed had pledges on all of those things. I think some of those were a lot more concrete than others. Some of those definitely, kind of turned the dial, if you like, in terms of emissions, and some of them were a bit of a flop and didn't really amount to much. I think one of the interesting things about how those pledges went down was the fact that the announcements were very definitely managed in terms of the way that they were put out to the press. So we had this dynamic where the government, the UK government, that is, was putting out press releases with quite minimal detail, quite late at night often, hoping then to get headlines the next day in the papers, and only then later releasing details. So, for example, on the coal pledge, we had these headlines about new countries signing up to pledges on moving away from coal, and it only emerged much later that that the pledges weren't quite as concrete as we'd realised. So that was interesting. The other thing that Glasgow was trying to do was what ended up being called the Glasgow Climate Pact, and that was this very broad, overarching kind of political statement, which was attached to the COP outcome, and it's in a way is relatively unprecedented. What they did at COP25 was sort of a precedent, but that was much shorter and covered much less ground. But really, that decision that they took in the pact was a reflection of the fact that we are where we are, and there's this huge gap between where we want to go and where we're actually headed.
Okay, so let's talk about some key pledges or outcomes, right? Like what were, if I have to tell you to pick a few, which you think are really critical for addressing the climate crisis, what would you think would be some key pledges / text in the Glasgow Pact that you think are key? And what do you think are some areas that really needs to be strengthened going forward?
So in terms of the pledges, I think despite what I talked about, there's clearly a lot of uncertainty about the details on some of the coal pledges, but I nevertheless think they're very significant. We had countries like Poland, Indonesia, Vietnam. Even if they later kind of backtracked, some of those countries like Poland talking about only phasing out coal by 2049, but the fact that they are now talking, they're in a dialogue about moving away from coal, and we've seen before with countries like Germany where once that conversation has started, it kind of only goes one way. So Germany started with the 2038 phase out date, and now the incoming coalition, they're talking about 2030. So that's genuinely a significant move, even though the details will only emerge over time. In terms of the sort of substantive negotiations in Glasgow, completing the Paris rulebook is significant. There's two things that I would pick out from that. One is the transparency rules. So under the old rules of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, basically only rich countries have to report regularly on their emissions. And so you get this situation where even some very major emitters haven't reported on their emissions officially for many years. So Iran since I think about 2014, or perhaps even earlier. So I'm going to get these details wrong, but China's 2014, India I think not since 2016, and those reports are retrospective as well. So the 2016 report might reflect emissions from 2 years earlier. So this is just this huge information gap when we're trying to assess how we're collectively progressing in terms of our emissions, but also in terms of our progress towards our targets. So in Glasgow, what they agreed was the final details of the Paris Enhanced Transparency Framework. Under that, from 2024, all countries will have to report in a consistent way every 2 years on their emissions, on their progress towards their targets, and on the climate finance that they provide, and on what they receive. So that's a really big step forward. That should hopefully make it easier to really see whether countries are living up to their promises. And after all, that peer pressure, that potential for naming and shaming is at the heart of the Paris process. The second thing I would pick out is Article 6. So this is from the Paris Agreement, and it covers cooperative approaches to tackling climate change, primarily through carbon markets. They've been wrangling over those rules for years now, at least 4 years, and they've so far failed. Until Glasgow, they had failed to reach an agreement. They have now done that. There have been big fears about the potential for these rules to really undermine the ambition of Paris. I think that the dust is still settling somewhat, but I think some of the worst potential outcomes have been avoided in terms of two different countries both counting the same emissions reductions. That's pretty much been ruled out. They have agreed to carry forward emissions credits from the Kyoto Protocol, so from the pre-2020 period, quite significant numbers, something like 300 million tonnes worth. But in the end, that was the compromise that they needed to get over the line.
So can we talk about the actual pact itself? Like, what does it contain, and what are some of the details in the pact?
Yeah, so this Glasgow Climate Pact, as I said, it's a relatively unusual thing for the UK presidency to have done. They didn't have a formal mandate for this, but ultimately they managed to get it through by consensus. Now, some of the key things in there include on ambition in terms of cutting emissions. So they've agreed that collectively there's this huge gap between where we are headed and where we need to be for 1.5 degrees. And not only that, but the Paris Agreement's ratchet mechanism, which is meant to increase ambition over time, wouldn't have kicked in time, because we've already had one round of the ratchet and we're still falling well short. So the next round of the ratchet wouldn't have affected emissions in 2030 because it applies to the period after that. And so if we're going to close that ambition gap in 2030, the only way is for countries to come back and offer more ambition before 2030. So what the pact does is it requests all parties, so that's every country of the world, to revisit and strengthen, in the exact words that they used, their climate pledges by the end of next year. Now, there's legitimate debate over how strong the word requests is. It's clearly an instruction. It's definitely on the stronger end of things. But it's the same sort of language that was used in the Paris Agreement to request parties to come back with more ambitious pledges before COP26. And as we know, not all countries actually did do that. It was only about 150 out of 190 or so countries that actually raised their pledges. And some of them updated their pledges and actually went backwards. So we shall see what happens next year. I did see that the Australian government has already said that they're not planning to update their pledge next year. But again, that's how the Paris Agreement works. Countries can ignore stuff, but they will get called out. They will face diplomatic pressure. They will be called out by civil society organisations and in the press for their failure to live up to what they've agreed in this climate pact. In other areas, I think it's fair to say that there was disappointment. So there was an unprecedented mention of coal. This is the first time that a COP decision has mentioned coal directly in the context of actually reducing the use of coal as a way to tackle climate change. There was a big hoo-ha right at the end of the summit where the text was watered down from a phase out of coal to just a phase down. I personally think that worrying about the difference between those words is misplaced, and the fact that coal is now in there and is targeted directly, that in the same way as with the national coal pledges, that's a significant shift, and that does send a clear signal to the market, to investors, and so on. In terms of other areas, developing countries had been very keen to see a Glasgow loss and damage facility be created in Glasgow, hence the name. And this is about loss and damage, which is, the effects of climate change that are already happening now and which can't be avoided. And they effectively want money to help them deal with that, whether it's recovering from, hurricanes or severe flooding. There's a very immediate need for money to help deal with those impacts. Now that wasn't agreed. So many countries left disappointed by that. But what they have done is a dialogue. They've agreed on a Glasgow dialogue that over the next year will talk about this issue of loss and damage finance. Whether that will lead anywhere, I don't know, but it certainly puts a marker on the agenda for that topic. In other areas, there was lots of discussion on climate finance, the fact that developing countries haven't yet received the 100 billion they were promised, and rich countries were supposed to be giving 100 billion in climate finance every year by 2020. It's already after that point and they haven't done it. So the Glasgow Pact notes with deep regret the fact that this hasn't been delivered and promises to do better effectively. And on adaptation finance, there was a pledge to double that. So that was a significant win for developing countries. I don't think that was expected.
So one of the things, I think this will be a good point for our viewers to remember. I mean, there is no legally binding, the way UNFCCC works. None of this is legally binding, right? Countries can go back and there's a new government in the country, and then they can completely, revisit. There is, although, the naming and shaming, phenomenon. Is there anything else that drives countries to go back and do more beyond climate concerns, of course?
Yeah, so the legal structure of the Paris Agreement is not entirely straightforward, but it isn't true to say that it's entirely voluntary. So if you sign up to the Paris Agreement, you do have to do certain things. You have to have a climate pledge, for example. You have to update it every 5 years, or at least send back your old pledge. And that's a deliberate kind of ploy to make sure that those that refuse to update have to sort of publicly fess up to doing that. There are these new reporting requirements in terms of your emissions and progress towards your climate pledges. And in addition, there are requirements for developed countries to give climate finance and so on. Having said that, it is the case that there is very little that can be done to compel sovereign nations to do something that they don't want to do. So one of the other ideas in the Paris Agreement is that the climate pledges countries make are nationally determined. And so they are supposed to be put forward by countries according to their own perceptions of their national interests. Pledges are meant to get stronger over time and so on. But ultimately, countries put forward their pledges because they think it's in their interests to do so. I mean, in terms of how to make pledges into reality, there's lots of other stuff that needs to happen, particularly at the national level. So, there's this whole international process, but that can only do so much. What really needs to change for emissions to start coming down is on the ground. So national pledges need to be turned into policies and measures, whether that's tax incentives, subsidies, regulations, finance, loans, whatever it is. And in addition, you need action from, civil society, from businesses, protest movements, opposition leaders in politics and so on. So really all of those things have to come together. And then obviously there's, developments in terms of technology costs and so on that we've seen with renewables, electric vehicles, etc., which have made, some of the advances in ambition that we've seen over the last 5 years possible.
So let's talk a little bit about, what kind of stuff will happen at Egypt, the next COP. Like what are, you touched upon some of the points, but like, what are countries supposed to do when they go back to Egypt? It's not this big COP, right? It's a smaller COP. And can you explain like what should countries do before? How should they prepare before they go to the next COP?
Yeah, so COP26 was seen as a particularly significant COP because it was the fifth after Paris COP21. And under the Paris Agreement ratchet mechanism, countries are supposed to, every 5 years, take a look at their pledges, take a look at the collective progress that countries are making towards the goals of the Paris Agreement, namely staying well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts towards 1.5. And they're meant to say, okay, well, we're not doing enough, so here's a more ambitious pledge. And we already did see that before Glasgow. As I said, more than 150 countries submitted new or updated NDCs. Now, COP27 isn't one of those moments that happens every 5 years, but because of the wording of the Glasgow Climate Pact, there is now this expectation that actually countries will revisit their pledges. So we will see, but that certainly will be expected that all countries will take another look, see if they think that they can eke out a little bit more ambition. Obviously, one of the challenges there is that countries have already been going through domestic political processes in order to agree to raise their pledge. And to do so again in just another year is, certainly challenging. But that's what they've all agreed to in Glasgow, so that will be expected. There's also going to be a series of things like, work programs, roundtables, discussion on the long term, the successor to the 100 billion climate finance goal. There's going to be this Glasgow dialogue on the loss and damage finance. A whole series of other things of that nature, which will take place before and during COP27 next year in Egypt.
Right. So overall, I'm sure when you were at COP, you interacted with like delegates from like different countries, right? Do you get a sense that overall people were satisfied and happy with the outcome of the Glasgow Pact, and which sort of types of countries were more happy, and if they were, and if you found during your interaction who were deeply disappointed with the outcome?
So I think I mentioned already that there was this big push from developing countries, particularly the G77 group of developing countries, which is allied with China, and also AOSIS, which is the small island states. They had been pushing this idea of a Glasgow loss and damage facility. They didn't get that, and there was a I guess you would say an outcry. There was definitely kind of an emotional reaction immediately on finding out that wasn't going to happen. I think it was quite interesting to see in the kind of press statements that a lot of those people were putting out, actually, that a lot of them were trying to find a more balanced response. They're welcoming the doubling of climate adaptation finance. They were welcoming some of the other elements of the pact, and ultimately, I guess they all have to come back to the table next year. So they want to stay friends. In terms of what else happened, this watering down of the wording on coal. It's hard to tell how deep those feelings run, but certainly, what actually happened was that there were behind the scenes negotiations. I think primarily at the last minute between the biggest emitters, so the EU, China, India, the US, and the UK as the COP presidency, and they agreed to this wording. But it was quite an unusual move that the UK presidency basically forced India to publicly ask for what they wanted. So the Indian Environment Minister was forced to stand on the plenary floor and read out this weaker wording. And as soon as he'd done that, a whole series of countries, from Fiji, Mexico, the EU Commissioner, Frans Timmermans, and so on, they all stood up and expressed how disappointed they were with this. I think a lot of that was perhaps theatrics, although, obviously there was genuine disappointment.
Speaking of the coal pledge, this was not just India, right? Or I have it wrong. I think this is a collective, like you mentioned, between EU, US, China, and India. Could you speak to that? Like what happened? What transpired there?
Yeah, so what you can see is that the language that they ultimately adopted about phasing down coal rather than phasing it out, you can trace that language back through a series of documents. So similar language appears in the joint US-China statement that they put out at the end of the first week of the COP. And similar language also appears in China's domestic policy in terms of its 15th five-year plan and its NDC, its climate pledge under the Paris, where they've said that they're going to phase down coal use during the 15th five-year plan period, which is 2025 to 2030. So, I think it wasn't just India, certainly that's the case. There's also an interesting twist, which is that towards the end of last week, the Indian Environment Minister had actually proposed slightly different wording that would have targeted a phase down of all fossil fuels, but he'd couched it in the kind of context of, something that Indian politicians have often said, which is about this idea of India being allowed a fair share of the global carbon budget. And it had also put an onus, particularly on developed countries, to take action on phasing down fossil fuels. So, obviously that wording wasn't acceptable either. But it certainly wasn't just India. Also other major developing countries reliant on coal, such as China, South Africa, and so on.
Sorry, I'm going to push you a little bit more on that. So why was this language of, ultimately we want to phase out all fossil fuels. We understand coal is more dirty and, it emits more carbon dioxide. But, to meet all these targets, it's very clear that we have to phase out all these fossil fuels. So why is the world not ready for that language rather than just focused so much on coal?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. It certainly provoked a lot of debate, in the hours since that wording was agreed. What I would say is, I did look back on reflection. I was thinking about this, and I looked back at what did the IPCC say in its special report on 1.5 degrees, and they assessed the available pathways that had been published at that time about what do you have to do if you want to stay below 1.5 degrees, what does it take? And it's certainly the case that in those pathways, coal use has to really plummet, and including this decade, and to a much greater extent than oil or gas. So I think there is some scientific justification for the more immediate focus on coal. And I think it's clear that if you don't tackle coal this decade, then it becomes extremely difficult to stay below 1.5 degrees. And indeed, if you don't cut emissions overall, but particularly from coal this decade, effectively you either give up on 1.5 degrees or you're reliant on massive deployment of negative emissions. So, in the longer run, it is true to say that all fossil fuels need to be tackled. But I think in that sort of nearer term, that there probably is scientific support for the focus on coal, albeit it is very challenging for a developing country with a rapidly growing economy, massive and growing population like India, where millions of people, probably hundreds of millions of people, remain in poverty without access to energy.
Right. I mean, I'm definitely not questioning the IPCC, but it depends on the which pathway you sort of like select, right? You can also perhaps take different pathways. But let's move on to the final sort of like set of questions that I want to ask, which is centered around like, how do you make this process more efficient, more ambitious? Is there some lessons that a future presidency can learn out of both the conferences that you attended, of the 4 conferences that you've attended, that they can take home so as to make this process more seamless, both for participants like the diplomats, but also for civil society and others, journalists, especially for people coming from emerging economies, developing countries, so that they feel at home in these conferences, because there was a lot of criticism about, COVID restrictions and all that. So do you have a sense of what are some of the things that can be done in the future?
Wow. So, I mean, that's a really big question. I'm not sure I've, given it a huge amount of thought. I mean, I think some of the stuff is just a matter of logistics. So, compared to, say, the Paris or the Madrid COPs, those took place in extremely large venues. There was a lot of space. And, just really simple stuff like there were very few chairs or plug sockets and desks available in Glasgow. And that made everyone's life difficult. I mean, we were very lucky as Carbon Brief. We had one of in the media zone, there are little kind of booths that you can book ahead of time. And we had one of those, which was a real lifesaver. For many observer organisations in particular, they were reduced to sitting on the floor and, rushing around trying to find plug sockets to charge their mobiles, their laptops, and so on. So that sort of stuff seems to me pretty unforgivable. I mean, I don't see how you can, they had 2 years to organise it. That seems like a no-brainer just to get those sorts of little details right. I think it's definitely moved on in terms of, the COP process in terms of access online. A lot of the press briefings, the plenaries and so on are available online. Lots of people were watching the closing plenary live as it happened, and you could see the huddles, these sort of frantic last-minute negotiations between the big players as they were, huddling on the plenary floor. So in terms of, that kind of thing, I think there have been improvements. Presumably it's possible to go further, and that would be a help. I mean, in terms of, a bigger picture like the COP process, I mean, that's definitely a much more difficult one. And it speaks to what I mentioned earlier, which is, the very kind of nature of the COP is changing. And, it's no longer about coming up with big international agreements. It's about making sure that they're effectively implemented. What role does the COP have in that? I mean, I guess, some people would say, well, the COP's kind of an irrelevance. I mean, COP26 definitely tried to make itself relevant, with stuff like the Glasgow Climate Pact and the Leaders' Summit and all the pledges that came with it. One of the things people mentioned is that a lot of those pledges are just, they're just promises, they're just words. And in order for those to become a bit more tangible, you could, for example, see those translated into countries' nationally determined contributions. Those, they're bits of paper, so they're still just words in a sense, but they are submitted to the UN in public for everyone to see, and for people to have to report on their progress. And, so that certainly could make some of the pledges a bit more concrete.
As a journalist, you're covering this, and I think this goes back to my question about there's so much going on. How do you keep balanced and make sure that, you can see what is bullshit and what is really it's a genuine pledge and all of that. If you were to give advice to many people who will attend the next COP, what would be your personal advice to a few tips or anything that you want to share that might be very helpful for anyone attending, including journalists attending the next COP?
Yeah, I mean, this is also a very challenging question. I think, so Carbon Brief is quite an unusual journalistic organisation. We're fully grant funded, which is a great privilege, and that means that we hopefully have just published our summary of the COP. But actually, during the 2 weeks, apart from updating on social media, on Twitter and so on, I wasn't filing stories every day, and that is a great advantage in terms of interpreting pledges, trying to work, separate, fact from fiction, spotting the bullshit and so on, because it means that you can wait. It means you can talk to people, you can talk to, whether that's, negotiators, whether that's observers, other journalists, all of the things that journalists normally do to try and bottom out the story. If you have more time, it's easier to do that. So, I think it's an advantage that, that we're very lucky to have at Carbon Brief. But, I guess I would say, my advice would be, definitely make sure you're not just going with the latest rumour or, what seems like the story before you've actually looked into the details.
So with the very final question, I just want to end by asking that if all these pledges are met, would the world be under 1.5? And if not, that what's the latest science around where we will get at?
One of the things that was quite helpful in terms of understanding the impact of some of these quite flashy pledges, big numbers being talked about in terms of countries signing up to stop deforestation and so on, was that there was this very active, very live process of scientists and analysts trying to work out in real time during the summit, what do they actually add up to? And it was actually some really interesting findings. I think, first of all, it's quite useful to step back and think about where we were before the Paris Agreement and where we are today. And there's lots of caveats that go along with this, but before the Paris Agreement, it was quite plausible at that time that we might have been heading for something like 4 degrees of warming this century, which obviously would be catastrophic. In the years with the Paris Agreement itself, where all countries that signed up to it had to submit a pledge, that already significantly improved the situation in terms of on paper. So that's the biggest caveat with all of this is like implementation is key, right? But certainly, the Paris pledges did significantly shift things. We got to the point where by say 2020, collective ambition was at something like 2.7 degrees. And then we had the first Paris ratchet process under which countries submitted more ambitious pledges. So that's the ratchet turning around, it clunks forward very slowly in this case. And those new pledges for 2030 amounted to something like another 0.2 degrees off the ultimate warming. So we're down to 2.4. Again, the big caveat, if those pledges are met. Now, in Glasgow, we had a series of pledges on methane, trees, etc., coal. Now, some of my colleagues published analysis during the COP, according to which those pledges collectively were worth another 0.1 degrees. So that's another little tiny clunk forwards down to, I'm losing track, something like 2.3 degrees, right? Then, in addition to that, there are these longer term targets, so net zero targets for 2050, 2060, and India's target for 2070. Some of those are, legally binding. The UK's, for example. Some of those are much less concrete and much more vague. Let's say Australia or Saudi Arabia, where the details are really not there. But if you take all of those pledges at their word, then you get to something like 1.8 degrees. Now, some people got very upset when the International Energy Agency during the summit said, with all these new pledges, we're at 1.8 degrees, and I think there was consternation at the idea that it was job done. But actually, all of these assessments are remarkably similar in terms of the numbers. The numbers are the numbers, but it's about the nuance and how you present them. And obviously, the big gap now is not only to implement in full all of those pledges for 2030, for coal, for trees, for net zero by mid-century, but also there's still a gap between those pledges and what would be needed for 1.5 degrees. So the latest assessment is that 2030 pledges would see a slight increase in emissions by 2030. In contrast, if we want to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, we actually need to cut emissions by 45% on 2010 levels. So we're still a very, very long way from that, even with all of these new pledges that we've seen before, during COP26 itself.
Yeah. Can I ask one more follow-up on that? So, there is a way we measure emissions of each, and there is an emission intensity measure for each process, and then it all aggregates, and you say from a coal station, this is the emissions total and all that. But do you think some of them is underreported? The reason I'm asking is there was a Washington Post story also, right, assessing that some of these emissions and the sort of like the reporting that was done was underreported. So do you think that adds another caveat to this?
So I think that Washington Post reporting was it was a huge piece, a massive amount of work that they did, and I think it shines a vital light on the question of emissions reporting. We talked already about the Paris Transparency Framework, and that's really important. And I think that Washington Post story really highlighted the fact that some major emitters haven't reported officially for a very long time. I think that they headlined it in a way that perhaps I don't agree with so much, because they focused on this idea that certain countries were underreporting their emissions. I think really what the story is that some countries aren't reporting regularly. The Paris Enhanced Transparency Framework is supposed to solve that. And secondly, that some countries aren't reporting in full for all gases, all sectors, simply because they don't have the technical capacity to do so. And again, that is a problem that the Paris Transparency Framework is designed to solve. So countries are allowed to claim flexibility. They're allowed to not report certain things. But if they do that, they have to basically put up their hand and say, we're claiming flexibility to not report, let's say, emissions from F gases, that are used for refrigerants. And they have to identify the technical needs that they have in order to do that in the future. And the next time they report, there's supposed to be an improvement over time. So, it's a real problem. I would hesitate to suggest that there's kind of nefarious action going on there, that people are deliberately underreporting. And I would add that, there's also independent scientific measurements or assessments of global emissions that are going on at the same time. So it's not like we have literally no idea, but nevertheless, the Paris reporting framework is very important.
Thank you. I know that you're really busy, so I really, really appreciate your time. It was a pleasure to interview you, and thank you for walking us through what happened and some of the key highlights at Glasgow.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
For more information about the podcast, visit us online at www.101reporters.com/podcast/the_India_energy_hour. You can also reach out to us on social media and send us your comments and suggestions. My Twitter handle is @SandeepPai with a double I, and Shreya's Twitter handle is @Shreya_J.